An interview with Douglas Wolk.
As already mentioned in Chapter 1, could you briefly share with readers who haven't read the book yet the process and main motivation behind reading approximately 27,000 Marvel comics for this project?
The idea of all of the Marvels came about when my son, who was then about 10 or 12 years old, decided that he wanted to read every Marvel comic book. And I thought, okay, well, this will be a good way for us to bond for a couple of weeks. He's only going to be interested in this for a couple of weeks. Well, he stayed interested for longer than that. And so we started reading through a bunch of old comics together. And I started thinking like, wow, these really are all one big story. I wonder what would happen if I looked at the whole story. I wonder what that whole big story would look like. I wonder if there's a book in this. And indeed there was. I thought it was going to take me about a year and a half to do all the research and writing, and 7 years later, here we are.
After reading Marvel comics continuously for many years, you mentioned noticing recurring themes and patterns. Which ones surprised you the most?
I think the biggest surprise in reading all these Marvel comics, in terms of themes that I noticed, was noticing how much of the big Marvel stories started moving underground, literally, between 1986 and 1989. There are so many important things that happened then below the surface of the Earth. Jean Grey's underwater cocoon, Spider-Man being buried in Kraven's Last Hunt, the emphasis on the Morlocks and underground tunnels in X-Men, the sequence in Hela's underworld and Thor, the Fantastic Four returning to the Mole Man's tunnels, and eventually it all bursts out again in Inferno. And I'm sure this wasn't coordinated. I'm sure nobody had the idea of, let's all move our stories underground. Let's see what's happening under the surface of the Earth. That was not something that anybody had in mind. And yet, a bunch of big stories from that period all do that thing. And that's really interesting to me. Decisions that are not made by anybody and still emerge in response to something going on in the culture.
In interviews like 9, the Vietnam years, and 15, Presidents, you mentioned how Marvel Comics reflects American socio-cultural reality. Which single story stands out most as a mirror to the era?
I think the most interesting mirror to its era is probably Steve Englehart's run on Captain America in the mid-1970s. Englehart has said, this is a quote from him, "America was moving from the overarching Vietnam War toward the specific crimes of Watergate. I was writing a man who believed in America's highest ideals at a time when America's president was a crook. I could not ignore that." So what he was trying to do with his Captain America was, again, to quote him, to write an ongoing journal of contemporary American reality. And he eventually realized that as immediate as comics were, they couldn't quite stay up to date with current events. But even so, there's so much about the America of the mid-1970s and the energy crisis and financial troubles and, the Symbionese Liberation Army and revolutionary groups here and there, and of course Richard Nixon at the middle of the entire thing, and that's all reflected in his Captain America, and it's just fascinating.
In Chapter 18, The Great Destroyer, you write about the fear of authoritarianism in series like Dark Reign. Considering current events, such as restrictions under Trump, do you see parallels in Marvel Comics being similarly constrained or self-censoring?
That's a good question. I think we may not have yet seen many comics that are reacting directly to the current and sort of terrifying American political climate, just because they're planned out and written so far in advance. I'm sure that, there are years and years worth of rough plans and months worth of moderate plans. Even so, I think we're seeing a little bit of reaction to the moment happening in One World Under Doom, which is a story that's going on in American Marvel Comics right now, where Doctor Doom sort of seizes power and takes over everything and is trying to make everything go his way. We'll see. Doom's United World is a lot more of a utopia than current United States is. And when I say that Dr. Doom has put together something better than what we've got, that's bad.
I assume you ended your book with Marvel Legacy number 1, 2017, because of space constraints. Are there any major developments in Marvel Comics since then that you wish you'd been able to include?
I ended all the Marvels with Marvel Legacy number 1, which came out at the end of 2017, because I had to stop somewhere, because otherwise I would have just kept reading forever. And actually, I did keep reading. I still read some new comics every week. I don't read them all, because I'm not getting paid to. But there are some developments in Marvel Comics for the last 8 years or so that would have been great to include. I loved the Krakoa period of the X-Men comics, the period that starts with House of X, Powers of 10, which I mentioned a little bit. But there's 5 years of amazing comics that came out of that, and all the X-Men titles sort of talking to each other and reacting to each other and building one massive narrative about what happens when the mutants decide to start their own nation. I have a lot to say about those Krakoa stories. I may get to say it somewhere. Also, from the last 8 years or so, Immortal Hulk. I think Immortal Hulk is going to be remembered as maybe the definitive Hulk story for a good long while.
Looking ahead to the future of the MCU, how do you anticipate individual comic volumes, series, and major events being adapted or integrated? We'd love to hear your predictions.
I have no idea what the MCU has planned, but obviously they've barely touched the X-Men yet, and there are a whole lot of possibilities there. Even some of the deep, dark corners of Marvel's comics have things that might make an interesting TV show or movie, or might not. It really depends on how it's handled. This time, a couple of years from now, we could be looking at a Skull the Slayer, The Living Mummy, although I think we're more likely to be looking at some more X-Men stories coming out in the MCU. I could be wrong.
If you are familiar with Japanese manga, could you share any observations about the relationship between Marvel Comics and Japanese manga? Are there Marvel Comics strongly influenced by Japanese manga or vice versa?
There have been a few Japanese manga that have been based on Marvel's comics and later translated and reprinted in the United States. There was Spider-Man, there was Hulk manga, and notably there was some X-Men manga. Right now, there's a mangaka named Peach Momoko, who is currently writing and drawing Ultimate X-Men, and has a look and a tone that's really unlike anything we think of as Western comics. It's really beautiful. Before that, Shonen Jump and Marvel published some collaborative comics in 2019 and 2020. Tsutomu Nihei did a miniseries called Wolverine Snicked in 2003. Kengo Kaji and Kazuo Koike wrote an issue of X-Men Unlimited together around that time. Before that, there was a very short-lived American project called Marvel Mangaverse that I think was mostly done by American artists and writers. And obviously, C.B. Cebulski, who's currently Marvel's editor-in-chief, is an enormous fan of manga. But I think the biggest moment when manga inspiration came to American comics was around 1982, when Frank Miller was picking up manga like Lone Wolf and Cub and taking visual ideas from those and putting them into the comics he was drawing in Wolverine and Daredevil. And then other artists picked up on what Frank Miller was doing. So for a while, you were getting sort of manga ideas at several removes.
How do you personally define Marvel Comics after completing this monumental reading project?
I think of Marvel Comics, with quotes around it, as being an enormous and evolving piece of fiction whose creators have all agreed to abide by each other's rules as they're created. And I sometimes hear people saying, but doesn't it reboot all the time? No, actually, there are relaunches all the time. There's a new issue number 1 of some ongoing series, but those are just on-ramps or doorways in. There's a new Fantastic Four #1 that came out last week, for instance, but that doesn't mean they're rebooting everything at the same time as the movie is happening. It means the movie is happening, people might be interested, people might be scared away by something that doesn't have a big #1 on the cover, but this is a way in. Everything that you see in any of these comics happened in the story. May not have always happened in the same universe in the story, but it mostly did, and it always remains part of the story.
Could you let us know about your current projects?
As far as my current projects go, I'm going to have to be a little bit secretive here because there's 2 of them that I'm not quite able to talk about yet, but I will say one of them has a lot to do with comics, but only a little to do with Marvel, and the other one has only one connection to comics, and that is through the early Marvel artist Al Hartley. That's all I can say right now.
Finally, please give us your personal message for your Japanese readers.
I do have a personal message for my Japanese readers. I am very, very grateful to all of you, and my hope is less that I can tell you about the comics that I love than that I can help you find comics that you will love. And I have a special message for you as my translator. Thank you so much for your efforts and for these very thoughtful questions. I hope this works well for you. Thank you.